We're going to get started, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the first seminar series of the revived, resurrected QSCP. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and acknowledge that learning has been ongoing on this land for millennia. This is the first of hopefully many seminars that we will host as the revitalized QSCP. Tonight we have Dr. Christopher Boredom on Žižek's Ontology. Future dates, we'll be meeting again next week, and the dates thereafter are listed on the QSCP website, which is qscp.net. Cruz will be posting a quote sheet that Dr. Boredom will be referring to throughout the seminar. And I just want to foreshadow that there is going to be another seminar series in September on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. So thank you very, very much for coming tonight. I'm going to be starting our first session with just in this short course, I am going to be taking Žižek seriously as a philosopher. Strange you have to say that about a philosopher who's published over 50 books, but in Žižek's case you have to, because often he's perceived as someone who sort of provides quirky and easy to understand explanations of Lacan, and sort of that's it. And when I actually started studying Žižek, back when I was master's in philosophy, I remember having a serious discussion with another undergraduate who just said Žižek's not a philosopher. And I'm like, no, I think he's a philosopher. Like, I've read his books; they're definitely about philosophy. And they just went, no, he's not. He's just this. He's not a philosopher. He's just like, yeah. So Žižek can be seen as a bit of a clown figure. I'm not going to be treating Žižek as trying to explicate his philosophical project in a systematic way as clearly as possible. And I'm going to be structuring around two questions. And the sort of two questions that guide philosophy from the beginning. So the first couple of sessions are going to be on what exists. And then the sessions after that begin to explore, okay, and once we understand his ontology, his account of being, what are the implications of that in terms of his account of freedom, his account of ethics, his account of politics. So a good thing, bad thing, is that he's also incredibly prolific. So while I was on Žižek, he was, on average, he published 2 or 3 books a year. So it's actually quite hard to keep up with Žižek if you're trying to write about him. Yeah, but I find that his work is incredibly repetitive. So partly to do with how Žižek sort of describes himself as a thinker. He says that writing for him is almost like a compulsion, and so he just has to be continually writing and producing. What it means, though, is that I think I can give you need to sort of pick up any Žižek book and understand its basic approach and to make it approachable. So that's what I'm going to try to do in these 6 sessions, and hopefully not misrepresent things too much. And okay, and Žižek, of course, is drawing on this continental tradition of philosophy. So we are going to be talking about and you know, and his basic project is to do a Lacanian reading of Hegel, and they're 2 of the most difficult thinkers to approach. So part of my goal is just to present the ideas in as clearly as I can, and not assuming any background knowledge. So if I haven't explained something, questions, I'm happy for people to interact and to ask questions and interrupt me if you think. But I'm going to be trying to use. I really am going to try to take things back to basics and not do any. I'm going to try to avoid doing like any sort of name dropping or something. So anything that I describe is going to be my my sort of very basic understanding of what those thinkers are saying. We're going to start with a joke. So this is from his latest book. So it was a new Žižek joke for me, but it actually he doesn't use this book to sum up his ontology, but I think it actually does sum up his ontology quite nicely. So the joke begins with a wife, and I'm going to read it directly in Žižek's words. The joke begins with a wife and her lover in bed. Suddenly, they hear her husband unexpectedly coming home and walking up the stairs, heavily drunk. The lover gets into a panic, but the wife calms him down. My husband is so drunk, he will not even notice that there is another man in the bed. Just stay where you are. And as she predicts, the husband, barely able to walk, just falls onto the bed. An hour or so later, he opens his eyes and says to his wife, "Darling, am I so drunk that I can't even count what I see? It seems to me that there are 6 legs at the bottom of the bed." The wife says soothingly, "Don't worry, just stand up, walk to the doors in front of the bed and take a clear look." The husband does this and exclaims, "You are right, there are only 4 legs." So I can go back to sleep again calmly. Now, the point of that joke is that often we think that we get the wrong image of things when subjectivity is involved, when it's the subject that's looking at the object. But in this joke, and this is sort of a way of approaching Žižek's like basic ontology, the problem is that it's by taking the subject out, it's by ignoring the way in which the subject's actually involved in reality that causes the misrepresentation of reality. The husband forgets that he's actually someone in the bed, and that 2 of the legs actually belong to him. Okay, so this is Žižek's project. Basically, he wants to develop a Lacanian to reconceptualize dialectical materialism, Marxism, and I'm going to explain what dialectical materialism means in a little while. But in a way that is, so he wants to be rigorously materialistic, but at the same time account for the reality of subjective commitments. So affirm the reality of things like freedom, ethics, truth, and so on. And he agrees with Badiou's definition of dialectical materialism that he provides in Logics of Worlds, which is that there are only bodies and languages, that's your materialism, except there are truths. And the except is important because the except is pointing out is that these truths or the possibility of truths is not something that is almost added on to languages and bodies, but actually comes out of the ways in which those things are always incomplete. So it's they're imminent. Its truth is an imminent exception. So, and this is just a quote from that sort of sums up. You're going to see this phrase a lot. Not all. So when we imagine the whole of reality, there is no longer any place for consciousness and subjectivity. And when you do that, options here, either you say subjectivity is an illusion, or reality is in itself not only epistemologically but ontologically not all. Okay, so I'm going to now. Don't worry if you don't understand that, because I'm going to unpack that now. Okay, so a little thought experiment. We're going to start by trying to imagine the whole of the universe. So if you imagine, we can start where we are. Google Earth. We go to Brisbane, and then we expand out, and you have planet Earth. Then we can expand out further, and we could go to our galaxy, and just keep going until you get to the whole of the universe. Now, when you get to that point, and you're saying, "I'm now looking at everything that's there," you seem to hit an impasse. And you really have 2 options. And the problem is this: if you're looking at the whole of the universe and you yourself are seeing it, are you a part of that universe or aren't you? So for you to conceptualize the whole of the universe, it seems like you have to be in some position to see it. And then that gives you 2 options. One option is you say, well, no, yeah, I'm this transcendental entity. I'm not a part of the universe. I'm separate from the universe. I'm looking at the universe from a position outside of the universe. I'm an exception. And if you do that, you can actually ground a whole. So I can say there is a whole of the universe. The universe exists as one thing because there's a point of exception, a point that's outside of it. Or then you can go the second option and go, well, no, that's actually silly. Because if I'm observing the universe and the universe is everything, I have to be a part of it. But if I'm a part of the universe and you include me in the universe, all of a sudden I'm just another part, which means that this point of exception, the point that I thought was transcendental, that I thought was sort of fixing and allowing me to discuss the whole of reality, it's actually just one of an endless potential of points I could use to come up with a similar vision. And what you get then is an incomplete series of possible positions from which I view an incomplete universe, because there's one thing I can never see, and that is myself from the position from which I'm seeing if I'm looking at the whole of the universe. I'm going to talk about Lacan's mirror stage here because it's basically the same point. So all of us look in the mirror every day, and we have an imaginary what we are and who we are as a person. But when you look in the mirror, there's one thing that you can never see. And the one thing you never see is the position of yourself from which you're seeing. The back of you, and we've all had or maybe not all of us, but like Maya changing rooms where there's like multiple mirrors, and you see like a vision of your back that you've never seen before and something like that. So we can see, mirrors do allow us to see things that we don't normally see. But even in a situation where I'm completely surrounded by mirrors, I still can't see myself from the position from which I'm looking. And that space is like a negativity. And what it means is for me to have a reflection, me to have an idea of myself, and this is basically Lacan's idea of the mirror stage, I have to be missing from that image in some way. I have to be subtracted from reality. I have to be this empty that's not included in the picture. That subtracted thing, it means that any idea of myself is always going to be minimally alienating. I can never just be myself. I'm always going to be someone that has that identity. So if we relate that idea of the subject back to like trying to think of everything, what you realize is that to have an account of the whole of reality, the moment you have a subject, the moment you have a point where reality is registered as appearing, you have to have incompleteness. Possible for reality to appear, this point that's subtracted from the universe for the universe to appear. It's this absence that has to be there for reality to come about at all. That's the basic paradox. And the important thing here is that this is actually a formal impasse. So it's not so much that this is just a thought experiment that shows that that shows the difficulties of imagining the whole. The point is that any time you try to construct some idea of a whole, you run up against these those two options, which are incompatible. Either you construct a whole, but you have to have a point of exception that grounds it as a totality. Well, no, the very thing that I'm using to ground the whole is a part of that. Then you allow for other possibilities to also come in and ground that whole, which means that you end up with an infinite series, and you don't get you get something that is non-all. So now I'm sort of going to, so Žižek and Badiou both have a similar idea. Žižek, reality sort of just says reality is fundamentally non-all. It's incomplete because for reality to happen, there has to be this point of exception that in a way makes reality, that generates reality as an appearance. But in a formal sense, you get a similar contradiction if you try to if you try to think in terms of set theory. And this is something that Badiou uses. He uses Russell's paradox to ground the reality. Okay, so it's quite straightforward. Set theory is just a theory that says it's just of turning anything into sets. So set theory just says, and it was a way of trying to ground mathematics and logic. So you can have a set of anything. I could just do a set of the chairs in this room. I could do a set of those. I could do a set of the tables. I could do So, but the idea is that that numbers are thinkable just on this premise that you can make a set of anything. But the moment you allow sets themselves to the way you generate the sets to be counted as sets, you run into this paradox, a very famous paradox, Russell's paradox. So let's say we've got sets, and we can make any sets that we want. Well, that means that we can make sets of things that are included in themselves and sets that are not included in themselves. Of all the chairs in this room, the set of all the chairs in this room is itself not a set. Sorry, is itself not a chair, so it's not included in the set. But if I was going to say the set of all sets that have more than 3 members, well, that set would be a member of itself, because there's probably more than 3 sets that have more than 3 members. Or you can take it to the extreme and just say, I want to create the set of all sets that have more than 1 member. Will that set have more than 1 member? Absolutely. There's definitely going to be more than 1 set, right? And the moment you do that, though, you can generate this set, the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. So all I want to do is take all the sets that are members of themselves, and here I'm going to have all the sets that are not members of themselves. And I should be able to take all the sets in the world and divide them into those 2 categories. The problem is, when we ask ourselves this question, is the set of that set that is not members of themselves a member of itself? Okay, well, if it is a member of itself, If it doesn't belong to itself, well, then it does belong to itself. And if it does belong to itself, that is, it is not a member of itself, that means it's not a member of itself. And you actually arrive at a paradox. Now, you have to understand what that paradox shows, though, and the way they get around it in set theory is they just say, well, you can't have self-belonging. And that's how it's one of the ZFC set theory that Badiou uses. So you just say, look, self-classification isn't allowed. Badiou uses that paradox to show why you can't have a set of all sets. Is it possible to have a set of all sets? Because if you have a set of all sets that belong to themselves, and if you want, the moment you allow this category that can't function, and you end up with incompleteness. What causes that? It's basically caused by the moment that you allow the way in sets. In other words, what you're doing is you're involving the very way in which knowledge is being produced into what you're knowing. And that's what causes the paradox. And that inability to capture, so that inability for the way in which we're knowing something, so the very methods by which we're knowing something and what we're knowing, for those two things to meet, that's just Hegel's dialectics, right? It's a very roundabout way to come to this point. That both Badiou and Žižek are all about this ontology that a universal knowledge is impossible. Basically, they're at this point that there is no such thing as a one when you approach that. And even on the surface, it seems like a minor thing to say that, well, reality is non-all, or that being is incomplete, or for Žižek is that the material reality is incomplete. It actually has very serious ramifications, ultimately. So my thesis would be whether or not you decide and how you generate your ontology actually does make a big difference for whether you believe things like choice, free will, and so on are important categories. And recently in my thinking, I've sort of been contrasting Badiou and Žižek with Deleuze here, just because we've been running a Deleuze reading group and coming to Deleuze after reading Žižek and Badiou, and look, I am very conscious I'm not approaching Deleuze charitably here, and I'm sure, and I don't understand Deleuze enough probably to be accurate here. So I'd be happy to have further discussions and to be properly educated about what Deleuze is actually putting forward. But one way, from his book on Deleuze, one way to see the difference between these ontologies is a cut. They say what's there is an incompleteness in being. For Badiou, that incompleteness is the event. For Žižek, the incompleteness is the subject, okay, which I'll explain more later. For Deleuze, there's just this totality. There's like there's a body without organs. There's this multiplicity. So that there's a monism in Deleuze, that whereas Badiou and Žižek privileges this not one, that there's an incompleteness in being. And what that means is that for Badiou and Žižek, there are generally new things that interrupt being, whereas for Deleuze, the new is just endlessly repeated. So for Deleuze, the only thing that repeats itself is difference. There's just endless newness. And this is important. Both Žižek and Badiou, as we'll see, come up with this idea that the ethical is all about interrupting being. That when you're talking about, and when we come to next week, we'll be talking all about the death drive. The whole point of the death drive is that what it means to be ethical means that you're no longer in sync with being. You're somehow disrupting nature, you're disrupting what's there. So they have this disruptive idea of ethics and commitment and politics. Whereas the Deleuzian approach, insofar as I understand at the moment, is very much about, no, what you want to do is constantly deterritorialize so you become one with that being. So it's almost like you become subsumed into it. Okay, that gives us a sort of a very basic overall of where we're headed. This is going to be the structure of the lesson. Look, I may not get to the critical responses. That may have been a bit ambitious. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about why Žižek is so insistent on using this term dialectical materialism. So that's going to be the Marxist basis. Then I'm going to talk about how he uses German idealism, so about Kant and Hegel to generate his ontology. Then I'm going to be talking about how he uses Lacan and how that fits into the ontology. And then you can see your basic matrix there of Žižek using Lacan to read Hegel to reinterpret Marxism, which is basically what he's doing in one sentence. Okay. Then, just to help with clarity's sake, I found one of the the best ways for me to approach Žižek was actually to look at people who have disagreed with him. So I was going to look at some alternatives to Žižek and look at, okay, look, how are those alternatives different from what Žižek is proposing? Okay. Dialectical materialism, heading 1. So when Žižek defines dialectical materialism, he'll just basically say, look, dialectical materialism is for him just an attempt to think substance and subject. And he's quoting there from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, where Hegel says the point is to think not just in terms of substance, but subject, and to bring those two together. And his basic point is that every objective reality is subjectively mediated, and this subjective involvement renders reality non-all. So reality is its appearance. And these are his 2 axioms of true materialism. The axiom of true materialism is not material reality is all there is, but a double one. There is nothing which is not material reality, and material reality is non-all. So you get a gap in reality, and that gap in reality is the subject. And what it means is that you have this part of being, this part of reality, which can never be colonized, which can never be finished, which is always going to be unfinishing things. And that is where you get all the possibility of freedom and ethics and so on. I'm going to come back to this again. So look, that's going to be repeated a lot. So don't worry if you don't understand it at the moment, because as I continue to go through it and it's repeated, you'll slowly, I think, begin to get the language and you begin to understand what Žižek is saying. This is Adrian Johnston's definition. And Adrian Johnston's a really, I think he's a great explicator of Žižek. And his definition is the Žižekian Hegel, or alternatively the Hegelian Žižekian, promotes a non-reductive materialism in the form of a monism of the not all one. I don't know why he says monism. Monism would be the philosophy that by saying a monism of a not all, it's almost like a contradictory monism, because it's an incomplete one. It's an unfinished one. A materialist ontology of the ground of being as a self-sundering substance, fracturing itself from within, so as to produce parallel splits between irreconcilable layers and tiers of existence. And if you want to think of, well, give me an example of this irreconcilable layers and tiers of existence, just go back to our first example of observing that universe. If you observe the whole of that universe, and then you say, okay, well, I can see the universe from this position, but now I have to take this position itself as a part of that reality. The moment that you then include that as part of the universe, you almost like have to see that, you have to create another position that's over here to see that inclusion. But then that creates another thing that now opens up. Okay, now I have to create another position to see that position. And again, you have that non-all structure. It just continually adds. And the point is that the real, that is the subject, just names that piece of unknowable absence that we can never fill, that we can never complete, that renders reality not all. But you see this point here, though, it's self-sundering substance. So instead of thinking of the subject as something other than substance, subject becomes substance in completing itself. Okay. And so one way to think of it is an immanent transcendence. So an important point is that the subject is not something other than substance. The subject is an absence in substance. If you think of so one analogy you could use would be a vase. So if you think of a vase, the vase creates an empty space. Now that empty space isn't a thing. It doesn't have any positive existence. But the very formal structure of the vase creates that absence so that we can talk about the inside of the vase as a different type of nothingness to just the air outside the vase. So that nothingness that is formally created by the vase would be like what the subject is. It doesn't positively exist anywhere. It's an absence that's created by the fact that there is appearing happening, that there's a reality happening. It doesn't have it's not another object in the world. It's an absence that's in the world because there's a world in the first place. And for that world to appear, there has to be something missing, and that something missing is just another name of the subject. So think of the subject as a nothingness in the substance, and you've got it.
And that's the basic idea there, is that we can't keep up with the effects of our own inscription in reality. The reality it creates is experience as having then an objective necessity. I love this quote from his book on the monstrosity of Christ. We create our world, but it overwhelms us, and we cannot grasp or control it. And this is what dialectics is about. What eludes the subject's grasp is not the complexity of transcendent reality, but the way the subject's own activity is inscribed in reality. And that's what like dialectical thinking is. If you go talk about Hegel, the basic idea of dialectics is that in our very act of knowing, in our very attempts to try to grasp the world, that itself has effects that are other than the knowledge that we've attempted to reproduce. So the act of trying to know and trying to understand is never quite at the same level as what we explicitly know and understand. And those contradictions lead to perpetual changes. Which is another way of thinking like Hegel is that there's almost like an unconscious dimension in thought. And so the truth of a position for Hegel is not the way in which what you explicitly believe measures up to reality. It's if you try to live out that belief and you try to make that belief work, what effects does it have? And how then does that inform the belief and change the belief? So dialectic sort of points to a radical, that there's always going to be that perpetual disjunction between what we know and how we're knowing, and that process of knowing. So a simple way of thinking about these, and we'll do this for the subject. So this would be the three stages of the dialectic. There's other versions of the dialectic if you're looking at Hegel, but this is a really simple one, like from an introductory guide to the phenomenology of spirit. So you have the abstract side, which is basically this understanding that just breaks everything up. So you separate things into different categories. A negative reason when you realize that, oh, hang on, by abstracting, I'm now missing things. My notion isn't fitting reality anymore. And then this speculative position where you apprehend where the very failure to understand the thing becomes a part of the thing itself. There's positive reason where you realize that and for Žižek, it's always this moment of, it's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's more that you have an idea, the idea is inadequate, but then you realize the inadequacy of the idea is a part of the idea. It's actually part of what the thing you were trying to explore. So I'll give you the example of the subject. I start with an abstract thing. Who am I? What am I? I come up with a series of categories. I could say I'm Australian. I'm a male. I'm a teacher. I like Žižek. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I list these different predicates. I could list my height. I could list my measurements. I could maybe include my DNA. I could get my medical records, get my latest results, and so on. And I could have a whole series of predicates for who I am. But then I get that list of predicates. Here I'm at this stage, and I go, hang on, none of them are me. None of them I seem to be something other than all these different ways of predicating myself. And no matter how I predicate myself, no matter how I describe myself, they always fail. And in the midst of that is when you say, oh, hang on, what I am is my failure to be those things. I am that negativity which carries those features, but which is never going to be the exact same as the features. So in my failure to grasp who I am, actually the thing that's other than anything that I am. And the contradiction becomes a part of my knowledge of who I am. So that would be an example of the dialectic working itself through. Now, Marx famously, Adrian Johnston wrote a book on Žižek's ontology. Call it a transcendental. Žižek had done is shown how by on all you allow for these moments of eruption and these moments of the new, these moments of commitment and so on. Žižek really stuck to dialectical materialism. So he wrote Less Than Nothing and in 2012 and Absolute Recall 2014, which is sort of, I think, his key texts. And in both of those, he talks about, he says, he's all about, I'm going to explain my dialectical materialism. It's very clear he wants to reappropriate this idea from Marxism. So dialectical materialism and Marxism
is just an idea that, so Hegel got things wrong because for Hegel, everything, he sort of got things around the wrong way. Marx thinks of the world, he always thinks in terms of the economy first. The way in which we think and the way in which the ideas we have are determined by the economic basis of things. So what Marx claims he does is he takes the idea of dialectic, that contradictions happen in the world and they work themselves out into new truths. And he says, and I'm just going to apply that to the material reality. So I'm going to put Lacan on his head, which is actually putting Lacan back. Sorry, Hegel on his head, which is actually putting Hegel back on his feet. He's putting getting Hegel out of the just idealism and putting him back on solid ground. And the basic idea there of dialectical materialism is that you have economic systems. Those economic systems, like capitalism, produce in they're supposed to run, are going to be inherently contradictory. They're going to produce contradiction. So that's how you're going to get social change. The material conditions themselves are contradictory. So it's still dialectical in that you have the contradictions leading to change, but instead of it being about ideas being contradictory, it's now the actual way the economy is working itself out. And what Žižek is basically doing by saying I'm a dialectical materialist and I'm rethinking dialectical materialism is he wants to take that point that Marx has made and says, oh, I'm going to put Hegel back on his feet, and he says, no, you got Hegel wrong. I want to go back to Hegel. Hegel had it right, and he wants to reappropriate that term back to give it a Hegelian. Because the big problem with dialectical materialism is that, well, it leads to the or not, there's some sort of revolution is inevitable. Is it necessary? Because if you're going to say that what causes the change are just these contradictions of capitalism working themselves out, it becomes really unclear exactly what the agency of the Communist Party or the revolutionaries should be. Are you just products of history, or are you people who produce history and so on? And so in reconceptualizing dialectical materialism, Žižek's aim ultimately is to answer a political question. And that political question is, how do we think of sort of these changes? So that's where you get to Žižek's Hegel from dialectical materialism. You think subject is substance with a Lacanian twist. And he wants to say, rather than saying that Hegel ignored the material world, what he rather shows reveals an incompleteness in material reality. And rather than think the subject as willing to understand the world as that's the reality of the world. Okay. And so ultimately his dialectical materialism is not just a social and political change to come about, but it's about rethinking what we mean by being, so you can actually ground a politics in a materialism that takes the category of the subjective seriously again. Be an effective history, or an effective discourse if you're looking at a body without organs that's constantly territorializing. Oh, but this is so if you sort of want to understand Žižek's position, Žižek's ontology, Hegel does to Kant. Rather than asking the question of what can I know about the world and what is true, you start by asking the question, how do things have to be for appearance to exist in the first place? So when reality appears, reality always appears as something incomplete. It appears as like there's always more we can know. What must material reality to be like that not knowing substance relationship? And what must substance be for that to happen? So he's not asking the question of what is there, or what's real, what's the truth. It's more that how is it that when reality appears to us, it appears as an appearance, that we intuitively think there's something other than what we're seeing to what there is. And the answer is, well, there must be not all, because it must have something that must be in reality, must be this subject. So how could, and that's it, how could in this how could something like appearance emerge? How's that even? Okay, so that's the dialectical materialism. Now I'm going to go into German idealism.
Okay, so we're going to go back to basics. Look, Kant basically, to resolve a number of problems that have come up in terms of like epistemology, tries to form a transcendental critique of pure reason. And what he claims is that there are these categories of understanding that we use to conceptualize anything that happens in the world. And anything that we can know is always filtered through these categories. And that means that we can never know self, which he calls the noumenal world, but only relative to the categories that structure our perception, the phenomenal world. And then through the antinomies of reason, Kant demonstrates that if you use those categories and you apply them to big metaphysical questions, you just end up with contradictory answers that are both right. So a really simple one is, was there a first cause? So one is you say, well, yes, I can prove there must be a first cause, there must be a first mover, because everything that exists is caused. But the same reason would say, yeah, but a first cause itself is contradictory, because the whole point is like a cause itself has to be caused. So there must be an infinite series of causes. And you just end up with two completely reasonable answers to the question of, is there a first cause? Not both of which can't be true, but both of which are completely provable, like using the rules of logic. And that's the example of antinomy. And what Kant demonstrates is that metaphysics has been about in the past is we have these categories of understanding that we use to understand the world, like cause and effect. Whenever we understand something, we understand things in terms of cause and effect. We take that category that we've used to understand the world and we apply it to something we could never experience. And we think it's going to give us these final answers. But in fact, what we're doing is something illegitimate, because we don't know what's actually there outside of the way in which our understanding is conceptualizing things. All we can ever see is the phenomenal, our perception. We can never see the thing as it is in itself, the noumenal. Okay. So, noumenal, okay. Sort of, yeah. So it would be, so for Kant, anytime we say, so like an assumption we have, for instance, that we form is, for instance, that objects cohere over time. And when you think about it, why should I assume that chair is the same chair now as it was 5 seconds ago? What allows me to assume time? And Kant would say, there's nothing in the chair that's caused. It's actually the way in which your cognition is working. The categories on that, where you apply some sort of principle of, there's a thing that constitutes the chair, like an X of the chair, and I'm using that to allow for to think of why things persist over time. It was the same in terms of cause and effect. If you go to try to observe cause and effect, you can't actually see it anywhere. So if I threw a rock through a window of it, and I said to you, just show me where the cause and effect happens. The rock caused the window to break. You'll never actually see it. What you'll see is a rock moving through the air, and you'll see glass breaking. You may even see a rock as a cause and some effect. Now, Kant doesn't say, therefore there's no such thing as causes and effects. He just says this is basically, it's a category that we use to conceptualize the world. And so long as we're using the category to talk about empirical things, it's fine, because we can all agree. So he saves science in that way. Whereas Hume, for instance, before Kant would sort of say, no, we actually don't know true or not. We're just using these. This is like we just have human nature that assumes that there's causes and effects, and that's it. So Kant would say, no, it's more than just human nature. It's like there's these categories of understanding. What we can't do is use them to think of things that we can't perceive. So we're just going to get answers that are contradictory. So we have the phenomenal and the noumenal. So Žižek sees Kant as though having a really important breakthrough. And the reason why he says it's such an important breakthrough and that nothing is the same after Kant is that Kant's basic premise is that the universe is that totality of being, which includes us as its part, cannot exist. So in the very first stages in like Critique of Pure Reason, for instance, Kant sort of points out that our concepts of time and space just can't be what's actually there, because they generate paradoxes. So
we can't help but use them to perceive the world and understand the world, but we just know that the way in which we're thinking things is just not what's there. And so he's the first one to sort of say, in fact, so therein lies the ultimate sense of this thesis that any use of the categories, and they're those a priori forms of thought, beyond the limits of our possible phenomenal experience is illegitimate. As soon as we try to imagine the universe as that totality of things in themselves, our reason gets entangled. So Kant's going to sort of point out that if you try to imagine like our first thought experiment, the whole of everything, you just end up with a legitimate concept of the absolute. And this is from his latest book, still talking about Kant. So he says the biggest cut in the history of philosophy takes place with Kant's transcendental revolution. So till Kant, philosophy, no matter how skeptic, was dealing with the ontological dimension in the simple sense of the nature of reality. What counts as reality? Can we know it? How is it really structured? Is it only material, even primarily spiritual, etc.? With Kant, reality is not simply given, waiting out there to be discovered by us. It is transcendentally constituted by the structure of categories through which we apprehend it. And after Kant, this is not in Kant, but after Kant, that transcendental structure becomes historicized. So the point being here that once you have Kant, you begin to have this idea that there can't be a conception of all conceptions of the world, that you can't actually you never have a theory or an understanding of everything. Okay, so now we come back to, this is very important, the shift from Kant to Hegel. And if you can understand this shift, you basically get Žižek's main argument. And it's this. It's a shift from epistemological obstacle to positive ontological. Our incomplete knowledge of the thing turns into a positive feature of the thing, which is itself incomplete and inconsistent. So, with Kant, I'm looking out onto the world. I see that there are things I can't understand. There's things that are missing. My knowledge of the world is incomplete. And there's an epistemological limitation. And what Hegel does and says, no, and the noumenal, that is what's there. When you think the phenomenal and the noumenal is like there's a distinction. What I know, you've sort of taken the subject out of the economic part of that reality. And what Hegel does is he says, no, what is there is our struggles to understand the world. That is reality. So you put the subject back into reality, and what do you get then? You the impossibility of complete knowledge or any sort of complete world is what is in the world. That is what's there. That's where you bring the idea of the Lacanian real. What is the thing that's stopping me from seeing everything? It's not that there's things I can't know. It's that for there to be a world, there has to be something subtracted from that world that is not in the world, which means it's incomplete. And the moment I have this incompleteness, the moment I have that point of subtraction, I'm going to have things that are missing in the actual world. So another way of pointing that out would be, you cannot have a thought of. Okay, here's another example. So let's say so what is reality before there's a subject? I can use the example of a table. So we know that there's a table here and it's an object. But what is that table actually? Now, from this point in reality, if I'm subtracting to reality from here, it's like a but if I was to zoom in using a microscope or something, which would bear no relation at all to now. Now that's still part of the table, but it's the reality of the table from a different subjective position. And now the thing that's been subtracted to stabilize an account of reality is just in a different location. Both of those accounts of what the table is, both of them are incomplete because there's no such thing in which I can view all the potential ways in which that could be a part of reality. What there is an infinite number of possibilities in which the table could be seen, subjectivized, turned into some sort of account of reality. Yes?
Yes, I guess the problem I have is why he and Badu bundles it in with reality. Why can't we say there's three positions the noumenal, the phenomenal, and this third position which they're putting forward, which I think totally makes sense. To me, they can all coexist, but they're not saying that. They're saying that no, this is it itself. This is part of it. That's the little gap I can't quite.
Sorry, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think I'm going to try and answer it, and then I probably. But is your point? So your point is that this third way of describing, like you have the phenomenal, there's a world as it is in itself.
Like
there's a way
are
we
they
perceive the
rejecting
world.
the noumenal completely?
No, I
Okay.
didn't say that. But what do you mean? What would it be to reject the noumenal?
That doesn't exist. That it's purely conceptual, and that if we really want to get close to reality, we have to embrace this conception of reality where there's this inherent paradox, which you're pointing out.
Yeah, but this is there an in
I guess
itself
we can
there?
never get to the noumenal, right?
Yeah.
I guess there's that thing like, okay, we can't get to it, but can that kind of idea sometimes Žižek
Yes.
talks about? Like, okay, I know, but can I sort of speculate maybe, or
Absolutely.
yeah?
But the point would be.
What I'm getting.
Yeah. So but the point. So like, there's things that I don't know about the desk, say. Now I could then use instruments and so on to get a different, and all that would be adding to my knowledge of the desk. What I can't get to would be some position where all the possible ways in which whatever the being of the desk becomes reality is totalized somewhere. Yeah. There's still now something that is always unknown in reality, though. So in terms of, if you're going to say, well, the noumenal is just it's just what is unknown. Yeah, in any account of reality, things are unknown because every account of reality is not all, hasn't necessarily. You can definitely get progressive knowledge with this ontology, and it's definitely not all saying, oh no, there's no such thing as once you've got this ontology, you're not discovering anything. It's not saying that at all. It's saying something like what you could never have would be a place or an account of reality that captures the whole of reality. And the noumenal, if you're going to describe noumenal as there's always something other than what I. Then that's
just I got to understanding him was he said once we have to be careful when we facts because if it doesn't include fantasy, it's not the whole picture. And I think that's getting close to what we're talking about here. Like this fantasy has to be part of our analysis of what we're calling reality. Otherwise,
the point would be if you
which is contradicting that noumenal idea in a way. It's counterintuitive. What's fantasy got to do with the table, right?
Yeah, and I'll get to that one.
I think I get it.
Yeah, that's when we bring in Lacan, which is like Lacan on, and that's the next step. So, but fantasy, but the point here, in fact, is exactly right because it'd say that you can have a fact, but what you think that fact means and what you're using that fact for really depends upon your fantasy frame. It depends upon what are your desires. So you can have someone who is, so you can have a fact like the literacy rates of First Nations Australians, for instance. It's a fact. You can have the analysis, but that can be used by someone.
Never just the fact.
Yeah, but how is it being presented, and what's the point of it being presented, and how is that reality being framed? Yeah. Now that's more Lacan than Hegel. So we're going to get to that. Yeah. Okay. So we come back to this question of what can we know, or what are the limits of our knowledge? A Hegelian appearance possible. How is it possible the world appears as an appearance? It appears as an appearance. And when you think about it, does that make sense? Why is it that when we look at the world, we don't just think, oh, I've got it. That's what's there. That's it. Instead, when it's like that reality as it is always appearing in some way, a full reality. Now, and this is, of course, where Žižek, is very much opposed to, I don't know what you'd call it, like a sort of common sense that would say, no, there's these natural laws, real things, and they explain everything. And they explain why we fall in love, and they explain why we make the decision. And our idea of self are just an illusion. that idea relies upon that it doesn't like the idea of Laplanche's demon, like this idea that if you had an entity that knew all the natural laws and knew the position of absolutely every material thing, that entity could predict exactly what's going to happen next. And what Žižek says is that that's a fantasy, a place where that exists, and there could. And when you have scientists who are putting that forward, it is basically it's a metaphysical prejudice. It's not something that science could ever prove. I don't know what experiment you could do to prove that there is something like a completed natural order. It's something. And his point is that in that there's no place for the subject. So the dimension of subjectivity can be conceived of only as something which is strictly codependent with the epistemological misrecognition of the positive order of being. So he's saying if you're going to have self-consciousness as that thing that allows appearance to happen, the only way to allow for that is to say, well, reality itself must be incomplete. There is reality only insofar as there is an ontological gap, a crack in its heart, excess, a foreign body which cannot be integrated into it. And that's the night of the world is just the Hegelian term for that, what that subject is, a pure subtraction. Yes. So there's no such thing. That's just another quote making the same point, saying that. So epistemological obstacle to positive ontology can also be called a deontologization. Because what he does is he takes the idea that there's this real in itself that's complete, that's existing separate from us, and says, no, that in itself is itself an effect of the way a subject is endlessly not properly described in reality in a way that makes that reality incomplete. So Kant only goes halfway in his destruction of metaphysics and still maintaining a reference to the thing in itself as an inaccessible entity. And Hegel is a radicalized Kant who moves from our negative axis absolute to the absolute itself as negativity. To put it in terms of Hegelian, or to put it in terms of the Hegelian shift from epistemological obstacle to positive ontological condition. As Kant, on the contrary, it is Kant who, insofar as he conceives the gap fully epistemological, continues to presuppose a fully constituted noumenal realm existing out, and it is Hegel who deontologizes Kant, introducing a gap into the very texture of reality. Another way of thinking about this shift, I'm repeating myself a lot, I don't know, but and again, you slowly start to get it. And these are passages, as I was trying to read Žižek, these are passages I struggled with again and again. It's like, what are you talking about? But this really helped me. This is from Less Than Nothing. He distinguishes between a metaphysical, a transcendental, and a speculative. So the first level is, well, there's an external reality and it's just independent of subjectivity, it's just out there. And that's sort of he calls it the metaphysical, and that's basically your scientific realism, as most people would common sense assumption. The transcendental says, no, we have to actually think about what are the very which we can know things in the first place. And those is not going to be complete. Knowledge is not going to be whole. So in itself, but we can know the conditions by which we know. And so that then relies on this dualistic distinction between things in themselves and things as we perceive them, which is the Kantian distinction. And then you have the speculative move, which is the Hegelian move, which is where you say, no, the act of knowing is a part of reality. So the very gap between the subject attempting to know and the objective reality is what is there. And you can't take that subject and think of looking in. You rather have to think of, no, what is there? It's always trying to grasp reality. So subjectivity is reinscribed into reality, but not simply reduced to part of objective reality. So while the subjective constitution of reality itself is fully admitted, this very split is transposed back into reality. And then again, you have that thought that what he's trying to get to is that you can't think of the subject as something separate from substance. Subject is substance unable to complete itself. And the negativity that's produced by that, that's a subject. So one way of thinking of that would be, if you're looking at your reflection, and you said the one thing you can't see is yourself in the position from which you're seeing, that pure point of emptiness, which would be the subject. Instead of see myself, think that because I can see myself, I must not be here in a way. There must be a nothingness. I can only see myself because I'm not that, what I see. So it's like, for that reality to happen, there's got to be something missing. And that's the subject. It's this structural, formal piece of nothing.
When you say you can't see from the position of what you're seeing, looking out through your eyes, looking into the mirror, is that what
No, I don't have. So,
what's missing from the picture, I guess, is what I'm asking.
What's missing from the yourself?
Can't we see?
Yeah, yourself from the position from which you're looking. That's what's missing. You can't see that.
Mm.
It's what's missing for the field of vision to appear.
Why is anything missing? Yes. Obvious question.
Yeah. Do you mean what?
But I do understand what he talks about the self as, or the subject as being translucent. Like that makes sense to me. Like when we try and put the camera around, it's like you fall through it. Is that nothingness that you're talking about? It's like it's not that it doesn't exist. It's translucent. It's transparent. You can't. There's nothing to grasp onto.
No,
Is that a different nothing?
it's the nothing. So it's here. The subject is the real. So it's and so you have to think of it as a formal impasse, which means a necessary constitutive condition of reality is that there has to be something not in that reality that allows the reality to appear in the first place.
I guess what I'm struggling with is why does that escape? Like in there, you were saying basic ontological reality. Why is it an exception to? Like, let's accept all that. I guess because the only way we can look at this is through subject. Get out. Yeah.
Yeah.
I sort of get it. What? It's like I get it, and then if I stop thinking about it, it's like, huh?
No, yeah, because
You know what I mean?
yeah, and it's because this attempt to think the Hegelian approach is completely, it's just, and it's the Lacanian approach as well. It's just very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
It's not the way in which we normally think about subjects and objects. What we tend to think is that there's a completed objective reality,
Yeah, like a
and I'm not part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and
But-
that's that thing when people talk about Hegel trying to escape him, like,
Yep.
I found it, and it's like, no, that's all incorporated in, and now
Yeah.
you're back.
Well, what makes Hegel's dialectic really impossible to escape is that it doesn't seem, unless you're going to come up with a way of thought that doesn't seem to involve some sort of contradiction, then yeah, and it does. So because Hegel's basic insight, or the way that I read it, is that that there's always going to be so one way I'd explain it would sort of be like just referring to like Lacanian unconscious, and one way to think of that is just that what we say can never be consistent with why we're saying it. The two just never cohere. So that's there's a difference between enunciated content and position of enunciation. So let's say that if I met you the first time at a party, and I said something, and it was, I don't know, like I made a bad joke, and then you didn't laugh, or I clear. Oh, I can see I offended you. I'm sorry I offended you. You say that, it's like, yeah, but what's the enunciated content? It's like the person isn't going to feel, they're probably just going to go, well, why is this person apologizing now? What do they want from me? Like, why are they feeling said? And it probably sounds like I want something from you. I promise I don't want anything to you. And then it's like, well, now they definitely want something from me, right? And there's so many examples of that. Like if you're walking through a shopping center and you hear like the enunciated content, there is no emergency, do not run for the exits. The first thing you do is you go, I'm going to run for the exits, because the only reason why someone would tell me there's no emergency is because there must be an emergency. If you're getting something from a guy at a kebab shop and he hands it to you, the kebab, and tells you the truth, you can eat this. Straight away, you're going to go, I'm not eating that. Like, why are you telling? Yeah. And the point is that anytime you say something, there's a subjective element to it. And that subjective element is, but what's the desire behind what you're saying? I can see what you're saying, but why? What do you want from me? How do you see me? How do you see yourself? And all that's caught up with that. And so those two things they can't meet. And what it means is we can never, in a way,
for language to be beings of the symbolic is to be beings who are always sort of haunted by that unconscious, always aware of the way in which what I say can be something other than what I've said, and we can't control it. Yeah.
Do you see that stuff as a postmodernist move?
No.
Because I don't either. Yeah.
No.
I don't either. But I have friends who, like, this is their problem with Žižek. They firmly see him as a postmodernist. They can't. They because I think they're misunderstanding this stuff. And
the reason
people that are really into the materialism.
The materialism.
Logic.
So that's we may not get to it this thing, but Žižek clashes with the new materialists because they want to think the world as just objects. So what they want to do is take the subject and say the subject is just another object.
Yeah.
And if we're treating the subject as something other than the object, then we're privileging humanity. Yeah. So what we need to do is just get rid of the human element, get rid of that subjectivity, and just treat it as another object. And Žižek's reply to that is it's exactly the same thing we were just talking about then. It's like, yeah, but what's your fantasy? Like if you're going to tell me that there's this ethic, and the ethic is by I'll take an example of Bennett. It's like we can get rid of the illusion of our human exceptionalism by practicing what she calls like a careful anthropomorphism and constantly saying how like no, everything's alive, everything's like a part of this matter. It's like, yeah, you can do that, but you can only but like who are you talking to? Are you talking to objects, or are you talking to subjects who can choose what they're going to do? So it seems like the very enunciated position you're coming from, your position of enunciation, is appealing to ethical subjects. You're saying this is how we should approach the world. So how can you say that we're just another object in the world when you're talking to me like I'm a subject and you're talking like you're a subject? Yeah. So that's Žižek's reply to that. And he, I probably won't get to it this week because we may not get there. But yes, but he has, I think, convincing replies to why he's very much opposed to this movement to, I guess it's a new vitalism, to try to think without the subject. Because what you end up with is you just end up again, it's with types of performative contradiction. Yeah. If someone comes up to you and says, I'm just another object, like that's a pretty scary thing for someone to say. It's like, what do you want? Yeah, it's like, what are you going to do to me? Yeah. It's like, I'm not. Yeah.
Actually, it's a kind of thing.
Be an object for a subject, can't it?
Yeah. Well, that's.
I mean, you could, no subjects, no objects. No objects, no subjects.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I mean, so one of the key things here, which is Mayasu, which I'll get to later, and his criticism of correlationism. And he accuses Žižek of being a correlationist, and Žižek's reply is to say, no, you've actually gone back to his account of the archaefossil has gone back to here.
Yeah.
And
yeah, exactly. Okay.
So can I just ask the difference with Hegel, which I don't know Žižek at all really, but he does a little bit. I do know what you're conveying is that he wants to say that he doesn't have any differences from Hegel, but that's not quite true, is it? Because in Hegel, the absolute subject is spirit, so all appearing is taken up, whereas Žižek is wanting to say that there's something in appearing which escapes.
yeah,
You always escape any subject trying to take it up. So that's a fundamental difference. There's no spirit, Geist, in Žižek.
Mind though for Hegel?
Yeah. So the Žižek has a heterodox reading of Hegel. So in a moment I'm going to, and you'll sort of see that for him, this is it here. Yeah, so on this interpretation of Hegelian dialectic, appearance there is, but these appearances are incomplete and or inconsistent with one another. So that's the idea. Again, you can never have one appearance. Žižek's interpretation of Hegel, absolute knowledge is not a totality. On the contrary, Žižek takes absolute knowledge to be the recognition that any totality is irreducible and inconsistent. So for him, Hegelian absolute knowledge is the realization position beyond the position of enunciation, which is a very strange. That's what Žižek claims the Hegelian position is. And sorry, there's some
read those out. But you just sort of see that idea there. What Hegel calls absolute knowing is the point at which he fully assumes the mediation of subject and object, when he abandons the untenable project of taking up position for his subjective experience and the way things are independently of his experience. In other words, absolute knowing is a name for the acceptance of the absolute limitation of the circle of our subjectivity, of the impossibility. It's like this realization that knowledge is necessarily incomplete. That's absolute knowing. Okay. Lacan. So now I want to talk about the same ontology, but I'm going to do it from the Lacanian lens and hopefully clarify things a little bit more. So, what is the subject for Lacan? That is, I think, the best definition I've found that Žižek uses. The subject is the void of negativity. It's the core of my being that is not some positive feature, but merely the capacity to mediate or negate all fixed determinations. So it is not what I am, but the negative way I relate to whatever I am. So that's sort of like the example I used earlier. The subject is not a person, and that's really important. The subject is not your ego. The subject is not your sense of self. For Lacan, the subject is always split, and what that basically means is that if you're going to have an idea of self, then you have to be alienated from that idea of self. So anytime you, and it's the same with language, right? If you're going to say something, then the position of enunciation is something other than what is said. If you're going to say I, then the I that speaks it is not the same as the I that's the symbolic. There's always those basic, there's always those splits there. And the subject of the unconscious for Lacan is just that it's an empty formal point. It's that the moment you're in the symbolic and someone says, oh, you're Matthew, or you're a member of the this family, and they point you and you get these labels, there's always a part of you that is carrying those labels that is not those labels. That the symbolic is in a way always imposed upon you. And there's a part of you that can't just be that can't just be subsumed into it. And again, that's not that's a constitutive condition of the symbolic happening in the first place. So you can't get to you can't have a name, you can't have an identity unless you have that alienation, because you have to have something subtracted from the identity for the identity to be there in the first place. If you just, and it's all I think that is, if you want to say like, my name is Chris, so I am Chris, there has to be something other than Chris, other than the name Chris, that's carrying Chris, for that name to work, for the name to even function in the first place. If I'm going to make a statement, there has to be something that is behind the statement, that's making the statement, that is, but the important thing is, these are created by the statement. It's not that, so it's that you have the symbolic, I am Chris, and that's what creates a subject, because there has to be something other than that name that's carrying it. In the same way, when you have that vision of reality, there has to be something subtracted from that reality that's not in that reality for it to exist. So the nothingness is a feature of reality and a constitutive condition of inside it. Yeah.
So everything is retroactively constituted a necessary condition.
Yes, yeah, definitely like your retroactivity there. Yeah. So it's not that this. So the subject. So if you have like that statement, like if I say I am Chris, exist that actually enunciated content. But once you have the enunciated content, then the subject was always already there, and there. Yeah. So that's the subject. And of course, for Žižek, that is the Cartesian cogito, because when Descartes does those series of doubting, and gets that formula, I think, therefore I am. One of the things he doubts is all the positive. I could be dreaming, so all the things I believe that I am positively could all be false. So I could only be dreaming that I'm a human being and that I'm living. That could all just be false. So he imagines here this pure subtracted point, which is just almost like pure thought, which isn't doing anything other than thinking. But of course, Lacan plays with that and even brings out the subjective dimension when you say, I think, therefore I am. Kant does a similar thing. When you say, I think, therefore I am, it's like, yeah, but is the first I the same as the second I? Like this first I just seems to be this pure thinking thing. You now seem to be positing some positive self.
that is actually that those two I's aren't the same thing. There's already a disjunction there. And so Lacan says things like, I think where I'm not and I'm not where you get that idea of the subject. That if I'm thinking, I must be somewhere other than what the thinking is for the thinking to happen. That's withdrawn. I'll skip over that one. Okay. And so then we come to the objectivity A. Now, so the objectivity A is just a name for the object cause of desire. When Žižek talks about his ontology, though, and conceptualizing his dialectical materialism is to say, well, the necessary conditions of reality are why, and which it seems a strange thing, because now you seem to have two things that are missing. So I'm going to attempt to explain why. So, for Lacan, desire is always related to lack. The thing that I want and the reason I desire it is always caught up with things other than just what the object is. And you can call that the object cause of desire. And for Lacan, it's always caught up with the other. So I'll use the example of corn chips. So let's say I really desire corn chips. It's not the object itself. There's the object. The object cause of desire is, what is it about the corn chips and how fantasy that's what I want, and how that then appears in the corn chips. So, and of course, Lacan does the other. So if you think of, and in the different meanings of that term. So if we desire something, it's related to what the other desires. It's what the other desires me to desire. Or it can also be what I'm desiring to please the other. So let's say I live in a world where corn chips are very rare, and they're a great status symbol, right? Now, you can see how in that world, the corn chips are still the same corn chips as in our world, but now the objet R would be very different. It would be like, oh, but there's actually like they're a status symbol. They're really special. And that objet petit R, like the effect desire, and how that somehow is in the object, that's the object cause of desire. It's not anything there, so it's missing. You never can get to it. So if I live in this wonderful world where corn chips are a great status symbol, and I open the corn chips and I smell them and eat them and so on, I never get to the object cause of desire. I just get corn chips. For it to always be an object cause of desire, I can never grasp it. So it's at once always something that's always missing, but it's also something that's excessive. So you could say that when the corn chips are that great status symbol and I'm seeking after them, it's like there's something in the corn chips that's big chips that makes the corn chips more than what they are. So that's again the object cause of desire. So describe this, and that's what Lacan's formula for fantasy is. So fantasy, to have something like reality, to have, I guess you could say, a human being, a reality, you always have to have the split subject related to the object petit R, and that's how you have a reality, a fantasy. Talks about fantasy though, and Lacan talks about fantasy. You can't think of it in terms of all things I'm fantasizing about. Fantasy are the coordinates of your desire. So it's not your secret desires you don't share with anyone or what you fantasize about. It's it's your answer to the question of what I should want, what I should desire. And the way so it's your fantasy is your very coordinates of desire. So all of us have things that we want to do and projects that we have and so on. So for Lacan, they're all structured by fantasy. And they'll all be related to our idea of ourselves, our idea of the people we look up to, our ideas of people we're trying to please, and so on. And that's going to then cause and structure our fantasies. So what we desire. So, but to think of the object PTA in a structural way, the basic ontology, you have to think of it as this way. The moment you have the subject subtracted from reality, what appears in reality will be something you can't get to. And that something you can't get to is just the counterpart of that subtraction. So, example of looking in the mirror.
I can think of. I look in the mirror. Because there's this split subject, I see myself, but I can't just directly identify. So I'm something other than my reflection, than my image of myself. The object PTR in that example would just be the idea that there is a real objective self out there that I can see in that reflection. So whereas the subject is this pure subtraction that's just being taken out of reality. The object is that when I look at myself in the mirror, oh, look, there's like a mysterious presence behind those eyes. And you'll have that in reality as well. The moment you have something subtracted from reality, there's parts of reality that I can't quite get to, that are always going to be missing, which are objectively there, but I'm experiencing them as something that's missing. Yeah.
This is probably kind of what came first, the chicken or the egg sort of question. But what comes first in this scenario, the OR or is it pre-ontic drive, or is it only constituted after entering subjectivity through the mirror stage? Then it retroactively becomes as if it was always there. Or is that a wrong reading?
No. It's my understanding is PTR is the counterpart of the subject. So we always have them both at the same time. One doesn't cause the other. The object PTR is the effect of having, so in a way, it's like I have the pure point of withdrawal that constitutes reality. An effect of that withdrawal means that there's always something missing in reality. And that missingness becomes something that I then see as an object in that reality that I can never complete or get to. So it's the way in which the subjective absence is inscribed in reality as something that's missing. That's the close I've come to. Yeah. So the same. So and Žižek even says like these two, like they're the effect of the same thing, but they can never meet.
So they're both pre-ontic. So they're there before it. They're the necessary conditions for being to arise in the first place.
Except again, you have to put the retroactivity in. So yeah, you're going to have that reality. Then these are the things that have to be there for that reality to be there. You're going to have at some point of withdrawal, and that withdrawal is going to mean that there's parts of that reality which are going to resist. So if you're going to think of it just in terms of our trying to see everything, reality appears. There's the subject is there, is withdrawn from it. Now I go out and I try to complete, and I try to find, I'm going to try and fill in reality. No matter how hard I search, no matter how much I see, I can never fill it all in. There's always going to be that hard kernel of something that's missing. That's the object PTA. And at the level of ontology. Yeah. So, yeah, okay. And that's just I think has a pretty good definition of it from a recent article he wrote with Spriglia, an introduction. So as defined by Lacan, the object PTA is a strange object which is not only lacking, but never object, but which is in itself nothing but an embodiment, the materialization of a lack. The object is a self-appearing of nothing. Its objective correlative can only be a strange object whose nature is to be the embodiment of nothing, an impossible object, an object the entire being of which is an embodiment of its own possibility, an object whose status is that of an anamorphous, a distorted projection. Yes. So you put those two things together and you can see how the ontology comes together as this whole. You're going to always have, for reality to appear, if you're going to think substance and subject, there has to be something subtracted, something missing. Missingness is actually going to appear in reality as it's incomplete, as something that can never be, that you can never get to. And if you want to think, Žižek following Lacan would call the real, like the real kernel of reality that we can never close, and its formal incompleteness, it's basically that impossibility. But the fact that you have those two gaps that are unable to be reconciled is what is there. That is the nothingness that makes reality possible. But that is what is there. So we can never perceive the real, but it's always, but what you can do is see that the structures that mean every single different appearance of reality has the same points of impossibility. And that's how the real sort of reveals itself in those repeated failures. Okay, and I'm going to leave that because I get to the sense, I feel like I've outlined the ontology, I've explained the Hegel, and then that would be a good place to stop and allow everyone to think and digest. So I've made suggestions for 2 readings, which I think are really helpful. So one was Adrian Johnston's, and these are on the website. So one is Adrian Johnston's, not the readings themselves, but just the references. But Adrian Johnston's explanation of less than nothing is really clear for going through the Hegel and the Kant and the Hegel. And that's just a great summary of the whole point of less than nothing, which is a very big book. And he does a great job at sort of explaining Žižek's project. The other good subject matters, which especially if it's responding to basically, it's Sprigler and Žižek responding to the new materialism, so responding to object-orientated ontologies and speculative realism and pointing out why you still need the category. So that's a really good, and they have a really good explanation of like that, the Lacanian object ontology in that. So those 2 would really complement sort of what I've gone through today. And also, I did have that list of quotes, which I'll make available on the, yeah. Next, where to from here? So I'm going to quickly skip to the end. I was very ambitious. So what we're going to be doing next, I'll go through the critical responses next week. So if you have some chance to think about that basic approach, what we'll do next week is look at, okay, what are the criticisms of that approach and how is it actually contrasting with the other ontologies that are really popular in continental philosophy at the moment. And then I'll go on to depth drive, because this is a really important, crucial category for Žižek, and it sort of forms the basis of his account for how subjectivity emerges. And yes, so that's what we'll do next week. So does anyone have any questions? We've got about 4 minutes. So yeah,
I've got heaps, so I'll just take up.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a good idea. So what I might do is I'll just close the session here. So if people want to go, they can. But if you want to stay behind and ask questions and talk more, I'll be hanging around.
Briefly on the readings,
Yep.
if you're currently studying, you've got access to a university account, they're probably available. But if you don't, we've got copies we can lend you.
Yeah.
So just get in touch.
Thank you, everybody. So next week, it'll be in this room again at the same.
Copyright. Okay. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'll have you.
Ending now.
Oh, I was going to quickly plug the Instagram.